The rain in Charleston did not fall. It materialized as a wall of gray water that turned 200-year-old clay into a treacherous slick. I stood waist-deep in the excavated trench alongside the eastern foundation of the Medina estate, the cold seeping through my soaked work shirt and settling deep into my ribs. The beam of my flashlight cut through the deluge, illuminating the reality of the load-bearing masonry. The mortar wasn't just crumbling, it was dissolving like sugar. Water poured over the brim of my hard hat. I wiped the grit from my jaw with the back of a mud-caked glove, calculating the hydrostatic pressure against the weakened brick. We were millimeters away from a catastrophic deflection. A subtle shift in the light caught my peripheral vision. I turned. She was standing there in the downpour. Caroline wore a simple white dress under a light sheer cardigan clothes that belonged in a sunlit parlor, not a flooded construction zone. She held a clear plastic umbrella over her head, though the wind was already driving the rain sideways, dampening the shoulders of the cardigan. She didn't retreat. She simply stepped closer to the edge of the trench, tilting the umbrella forward as if the fragile dome of plastic could somehow shield me from the storm. Behind her, elevated on the dry, sweeping safety of the wraparound porch, two figures stood watching us. Arthur and Eleanor Thorne, her uncle and aunt. They stood perfectly still beside the grand double doors, arms crossed, their silhouettes sharp against the warm, amber light of the foyer. They were waiting for me to fail. They were waiting for her to break. "You have no business being out here," I said, my voice barely carrying over the roar of the water hitting the tarps. I kept my distance, staying low in the mud. Caroline gripped the curved handle of the umbrella with both hands. Her knuckles were stark white. The sump pump in the basement stopped. The words were spoken quietly, but they hit like a physical blow. If the basement flooded, the temporary shoring jacks would sink into the softened earth. The entire eastern wall would come down. I looked up at her. I didn't see panic in her expression, only a profound, exhausted weight. She was 36 years old, fighting a sprawling legal and financial war against her own bloodline to keep this estate, and the exhaustion was carving hollows under her cheekbones. I looked away, focusing on the heavy steel lever of the hydraulic jack resting in the mud. "Go back inside. Lock the basement door. Don't let anyone down the stairs." "Jack," she started. "I will handle the pump," I said, cutting her off with the flat, undeniable tone of a man reciting a schematic. I reached down, grabbing the 60-pound extraction hose, hauling it over my shoulder. "Go inside, Ms. Medina, before they find another reason to declare you unfit to manage the property." She didn't move immediately. She simply stood in the rain, offering that small, clear canopy of protection until the wind forced her back toward the house. The basement was a subterranean nightmare of rising black water and the smell of ancient rotting pine. I waded into the dark, my boots sinking into the silt. The primary pump hadn't just failed. The electrical conduit had been cleanly severed. A clean cut meant human hands. Arthur Thorne's leverage wasn't just legal anymore. It was physical sabotage. The Historic Preservation Board he chaired had given Caroline 30 days to prove the structure was sound, or the trust would seize it and demolish the house for a condominium development. I waded to the secondary utility panel, pulling the heavy yellow flashlight from my belt. I clamped it between my teeth, the cold metal biting into my jaw, and stripped the heavy gauge wires with my pliers. My hands were numb, shaking slightly from the ambient temperature. But the movements were pure muscle memory. I bypassed the severed line, splicing the connection directly into the emergency generator feed. I threw the breaker. The heavy, rhythmic thud of the industrial pump kicked in. The water around my knees began to swirl, drawing back toward the drainage grate. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness from the top of the wooden stairs. Caroline stood on the landing. She had changed into heavy jeans and a thick wool sweater, holding a battery-powered lantern. "It's working," she said, her voice echoing off the damp brick. "Someone cut the line," I stated. I didn't soften the delivery. I walked to the base of the stairs, stopping 3 steps below her so I didn't track the contaminated water near her boots. "A wire cutter, 1/2-inch gauge. It wasn't rats." Caroline closed her eyes. The lantern light threw harsh shadows across her face. "Arthur. He brought a contractor by yesterday to assess the damage. I told them to leave. You need to document every person who steps on this property from now on." I told her, pulling a waterproof notebook from my chest pocket. I clicked my pen, logging the time, the water level, and the precise nature of the severed wire. "No one accesses the foundation without my explicit clearance. Not your uncle, not the city. He's going to file a safety violation." Caroline said, her voice dropping to a hollow whisper. "He told me this morning. He's filing an injunction to revoke our building permit because the site is unstable." I snapped the notebook shut. I looked up at her, my posture rigid. I was a structural engineer who had spent 10 years clawing my way up from framing houses to designing load-bearing architecture. But in Arthur Thorne's eyes, I was just the hired help holding a wrench. "The site is only unstable if I let it fall. I am not going to let it fall." She descended 1 step. The proximity forced me to look at the fine tension in her jaw. "Why are you fighting this hard for a house that isn't yours?" I didn't answer her. I couldn't tell her that it stopped being about the house the moment I saw her standing on the porch 3 weeks ago, fighting off a team of lawyers with nothing but a binder of historical documents and sheer stubborn grit. I simply turned my flashlight toward the receding waterline, securing the perimeter for the night ahead. The storm raged through the night, a relentless battering against the weakened siding of the house. By 3 in the morning, the rain had slowed to a steady, miserable drizzle. I was in the carriage house, a detached brick structure we had converted into a makeshift command center. The air inside smelled of wet wool ozone and drafting paper. I leaned over the massive oak table, adjusting the dial on the laser transit. The blueprints for the foundation retrofit were spread out beneath the harsh white glare of a portable work light. I was calculating the shear strength of the new steel girders we needed to install by Friday. The heavy wooden door pushed open. The wind rushed in, rustling the heavy sheets of vellum. Caroline walked in. She carried a heavy thermos and 2 ceramic mugs. She didn't announce herself. She simply walked to the edge of the drafting table and set the thermos down. The metal clinked against the wood. "You haven't slept," she observed. "Deflection equations don't sleep," I replied, not looking up from the calculator. I entered a load value, the buttons clicking sharply in the quiet room. She unscrewed the cap of the thermos. The thick, rich smell of dark roast coffee and chicory filled the cold space. She poured a cup and slid it across the blueprints, stopping exactly at the edge of my working perimeter. "You can't pour concrete if you're dead on your feet." I set the pencil down. The graphite rolled across the paper and stopped against a heavy steel ruler. I looked at the coffee, then at her. She was standing within arm's reach. I could see the fatigue lining her features, the quiet anxiety she refused to show the world. "The load calculations are tight," I said, shifting the topic to the only territory where I felt secure. I tapped a specific column of numbers. "We need to install the helical piers by Tuesday. If we hit bedrock at 30 feet, the structure stabilizes permanently. Arthur's injunction won't hold up in court if the math proves the house is beyond failure parameters." Caroline traced the edge of her mug. "He froze the primary trust account this afternoon. My aunt called me. They're trying to starve the project out. My jaw tightened. I picked up the mug she poured for me. The ceramic was incredibly hot, grounding the cold out of my palms. I have lines of credit with the steel suppliers. The materials will arrive on schedule. I can't ask you to front that cost, Jack, she said, her voice firming. She looked up, her gaze locking onto mine. This is my fight. You're my engineer, not my bank. If this goes wrong, you lose your firm. I set the mug down. I reached across the table, pulling a fresh sheet of paper from the stack. I picked up a heavy black marker and began writing. I didn't write a financial contract. I drew a calendar grid. I blocked out the next 14 days. I wrote helical pier delivery on Tuesday, concrete pour on Thursday, and on the final Friday, I didn't write Ms. Medina's inspection. I wrote in bold, stark letters, Caroline's final approval. I turned the paper around and slid it toward her. You're not losing the house, I stated, my voice dropping an octave, losing the clinical edge of the engineer. And I'm not losing my firm. The materials arrive Tuesday. She looked at the calendar. She looked at her name written in my handwriting. A small exhale escaped her lips. She didn't argue the money again. She just placed her hand flat on the paper, anchoring it to the table. The following week was a brutal theater of logistics and physical endurance. The humidity broke, leaving behind a sweltering heat. I was beneath the eastern portico operating the rotary hammer. The noise was deafening, a relentless bone-rattling percussion, as I bored through the damaged brick to reach the solid masonry behind it. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring the chalk lines I had snapped at dawn. Jack. I lowered the drill. Arthur Thorne stood at the edge of the safety fencing. He was wearing a tailored linen suit that looked utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of mud and heavy machinery. Beside him stood a man with a clipboard, a city inspector, though not one I recognized. You need to shut down the compressor, Arthur said, projecting his voice with the practiced authority of a man used to being obeyed. This site is under official review. I didn't turn off the compressor. I set the heavy drill down on a clean tarp, unclipped my safety harness, and walked to the perimeter fence. I wiped my hands on a rag, taking my time, letting the silence stretch. The permit is active until the 30th. I said, my voice level. I looked at the man with the clipboard. Who are you? City zoning, the man said, looking uncomfortable. He tapped the paper. We received a complaint about unauthorized excavation methods. We're issuing a temporary stop work order until a secondary geotechnical survey can be completed. Arthur smiled, a thin, satisfied line. It's for safety, Mr. Castillo. We can't have you collapsing the historic facade because you're out of your depth. The survey will take at least 3 weeks. 3 weeks meant missing the deadline. Missing the deadline meant Caroline lost the house. Heat climbed fast under my wet shirt. My jaw locked hard enough to ache, and the metal caliper bit into my palm as I closed my hand around it. Instead of vaulting the fence, I planted my boots in the mud and aimed every word at the inspector. A secondary geotechnical survey is only required if the excavation exceeds 10 feet without shoring. I recited my voice, dropping to a calm, terrifyingly flat cadence. I stepped up to the chain-link fence, my eyes fixed entirely on the city inspector. We are at 8.5 feet. Furthermore, the shoring in place is a steel-reinforced hydraulic system rated for 40 tons, detailed in schematic section 4B of the approved permit. The inspector blinked, looking down at his clipboard. The complaint stated you were trenching the foundation blindly. The complaint is fabricated, I said. I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my digital caliper and a laser depth gauge. I held them through the fence. Walk down there. Measure it yourself. If it is 1 inch over 8.5 feet, you can post the order. If it's not, you are harassing a legal work site under false pretenses, and I will have my firm's legal counsel file a formal grievance against your specific badge number by 3 o'clock. The inspector swallowed hard. He looked at Arthur, then back at the heavy steel tools in my hand. Do your job, I commanded quietly. The inspector didn't take the tools. He made a small note on his clipboard. The depth appears compliant from visual inspection. The complaint is unsubstantiated. Arthur's face flushed a dark, furious red. He opened his mouth to speak, but a voice cut through the heavy air from the porch. Arthur? Caroline stood on the top step. She wasn't wearing a dress today. She wore dark slacks and a blazer holding a thick file folder. She walked down the steps, her posture absolute. She stopped next to me, standing shoulder to shoulder behind the chain-link fence. You are trespassing, Caroline said to her uncle. Her voice didn't shake. The trust agreement states you have oversight on the financials, not the physical property, until the deadline. Remove yourself from my land, or I will have the police escort you off. Arthur stared at her, then at me. He scoffed a bitter, ugly sound. You're throwing away your future for a rotting pile of bricks and a contractor who doesn't even know what fork to use at a dinner party. You're a fool, Caroline. He turned and walked away, the inspector trailing quickly behind him. I stood perfectly still, the rag gripped tightly in my fist. Arthur's words hit the exact center of the unworthiness I carried. A contractor who doesn't know what fork to use. It was the truth of how her world saw me. Caroline turned to me. The fierce, unyielding armor she had worn for her uncle instantly vanished. Her shoulders dropped. She looked at my clenched fist, then up to my face. Thank you, she said quietly. I didn't say anything. I turned off the compressor. The silence in the yard was heavy. I needed to distance myself to retreat into the math and the steel, but I couldn't move. He's wrong, you know, Caroline added, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her. About everything, she clarified. She didn't offer a platitude. She didn't tell me I was brilliant or try to stroke my ego. She simply stated a fact anchored in reality. You just dismantled a city injunction with a depth gauge and a sentence. He's terrified of you. The yard went so quiet, I could hear the compressor ticking as it cooled. My grip tightened on the rag until damp grit pressed into my knuckles, and I took one measured step back to keep from reaching for her. I pointed to the safety line. Stay behind the orange mesh. I have to drop the next section of masonry. That evening, the power grid on the peninsula failed. A minor squall had blown through, knocking out a transformer 2 streets over. I found Caroline in the main parlor. The massive room was stripped of furniture, the hardwood floors covered in heavy canvas drop cloths. She was sitting on a wooden crate, her knees pulled to her chest, surrounded by a sea of financial documents, illuminated by a single battery-powered camping lantern. She looked small in the cavernous space. I walked in carrying a cast-iron skillet and a portable butane camp stove. I set them down on a solid section of the floor, away from the paperwork. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, though she quickly wiped her face. I was trying to reconcile the steel invoices. I think I found a discrepancy in the escrow account. Arthur might be siphoning. She stopped, her voice catching. Stop, I said. I knelt by the camp stove and ignited the burner. The blue flame hissed softly in the dark room. I opened a cooler I had brought from my truck and pulled out 2 thick ribeye steaks and a bundle of asparagus. Jack, I have to figure this out. She insisted, pulling a ledger closer to the lantern. You can't read numbers in the dark, and you haven't eaten since 6 this morning. I replied, tossing a slice of butter into the skillet. It sizzled instantly. The escrow account will be there tomorrow. Right now you are going to eat. I didn't ask her. I didn't offer to talk about her feelings. I provided a physical, undeniable anchor to reality. I cooked the food in silence, the rich smell of the searing meat filling the dusty parlor. I plated it on 2 heavy ceramic dishes from the kitchen and handed one to her along with a fork. I sat on a stack of drywall buckets across the lantern from her. We ate in silence for a long time. The sound of the wind rattling the old window panes was the only noise in the room. I watched her from the shadows. I watched the tension slowly leave her shoulders as the hot food hit her system. I watched the way she held the ceramic plate, grounding herself in the warmth. "Everyone says I should forget you," she said suddenly. Her voice was quiet, echoing slightly in the empty room. I froze, my fork hovering over my plate. "My aunt called me an hour ago." Caroline continued, staring into the lantern light. "She offered a buyout, $1 million. But the condition is that I fire you immediately, cancel the retrofit, and sign the deed over to the trust. They told me you're a liability, that you're going to drag me into bankruptcy." The darkness around the lantern felt very heavy. A cold, logical voice in my head told me her aunt was right. I was a liability. If I failed the math, she lost everything. "It's a logical offer," I forced myself to say. The words tasted like ash. $1 million secures your future. You could walk away cleanly. Caroline set her plate down on the canvas drop cloth. She stood up. She walked around the lantern, crossing the distance between us until she was standing directly in front of me. I looked up at her from my seat on the buckets. "I told them no," she said. "Caroline, you need to think practically." I saw the truth in your eyes. She interrupted, her voice gaining a sudden fierce strength. "The first day you walked onto this property, you didn't look at the rot and see a demolition. You looked at the foundation and saw what it could hold. You saw what was meant to be saved." She knelt down so we were eye level. The proximity was staggering. I could smell the faint scent of rain and vanilla on her skin. I kept my hands firmly planted on my knees, my knuckles white with the effort of not touching her. "I am not walking away," she stated, her gaze locking onto mine. "And I am not firing my partner." My chest seized. Partner. I didn't offer a grand speech. I didn't declare anything. I simply looked at the determination in her eyes, accepting the immense, terrifying weight of her trust. "The helical piers arrive tomorrow," I said, my voice rough. "We pour the concrete on Thursday." She smiled. It was a small, exhausted, beautiful thing. "Okay." On Wednesday, the midpoint twist arrived, not from the city, but from the sky. A late-season tropical depression stalled over the coast. The Weather Service upgraded it to a Category 1 hurricane warning by noon. The final inspection was scheduled for Friday morning at 8 a.m. The site descended into chaos. The wind was already stripping the leaves from the ancient oaks lining the driveway. I was in the trench, fighting to align the final steel bracket against the load-bearing pillar before the rain flooded the excavation entirely. The heavy machinery was useless. The mud was too deep. The Bobcat excavator was bogged down to the axles. "It won't reach, mower," shouted one of my crewmen over the howling wind, pointing to the hydraulic arm struggling to lift the 2-ton steel beam into place. I dropped my clipboard. "We do it manually. Grab the chain hoists." For the next 4 hours, it was a brutal, agonizing battle against physics and nature. We rigged heavy-duty chains to the intact oak trees above the trench, using manual leverage to winch the massive steel girder, inch by painful inch, into the structural pocket. My shoulders screamed in protest. The heavy chain tore through my gloves, scraping the skin off my knuckles. Caroline was on the porch, wrapped in a heavy raincoat. She wasn't watching helplessly. She was coordinating the delivery of tarps and sandbags with the rest of my crew, her voice cutting through the storm with startling authority. She was managing the logistics, keeping the site from dissolving around us. "Hold the tension," I roared, my boots slipping in the rising mud. I shoved my shoulder directly under the end of the steel beam, using my own body weight to guide it the last 3 inches as the crew lowered the hoist. The steel slid into the pocket with a heavy metallic crunch. "Lock it down," I yelled, reaching for the heavy impact wrench. I drove the massive galvanized bolts into the masonry, securing the structure. I climbed out of the trench just as the sky finally broke open, unleashing a torrential downpour. I was covered in gray mud grease and blood from my hands. I dismissed the crew, sending them home before the roads flooded completely. The yard was empty. The wind howled through the scaffolding. I walked up the steps to the porch. Caroline was standing by the double doors. She had a thick, dry towel in her hands. She didn't say a word. She stepped forward and draped the towel over my shoulders. The sudden weight and warmth of the fabric broke something in me. The adrenaline crashed, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion. I stopped. I didn't step back. She stepped closer until the towel brushed my chest. Her fingers closed on the towel at my shoulders, steadying there. "Jack," she said softly, and the look she gave me was clear enough that I didn't have to guess. I lifted my hands, my ruined, mud-caked hands, and deliberately kept them away from her clean clothes. Then I lowered my head. I kissed her. It was not a frantic, hungry collision. It was the principle of the arrival. It felt heavy. It felt like dropping a massive steel anchor to the ocean floor. It was a seal on a contract drawn up in the dark, a silent vow that the wandering was over. My mouth pressed against hers, firm and steady, demanding nothing but offering absolute, unyielding presence. She exhaled a shaky breath against my lips, her hands gripping the edges of the towel on my shoulders, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I pulled back just enough to look at her. "The foundation is secure," I said quietly. She nodded, her eyes bright in the dim light of the porch. "I know." Friday morning broke clear and devastatingly bright. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving behind debris and a crisp, cold air. At exactly 8 a.m., the city inspector arrived. Not the junior man from the week before, but the chief structural engineer for the county. And trailing behind him, looking smug and victorious, was Arthur Thorne. I stood in the driveway wearing clean boots and a fresh shirt, holding a thick binder of technical schematics. Caroline stood beside me, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. "Let's make this quick," Arthur said to the inspector. The storm clearly compromised the site. The trenches likely collapsed. I didn't look at Arthur. I looked at the chief inspector. I handed him the binder. Section 1 contains the continuous laser deflection logs from the last 48 hours. Section 2 contains the torque verification for the new helical piers. The inspector opened the binder. He frowned, turning the pages. He walked to the edge of the trench. The water had been pumped out. The new steel shoring gleamed dully in the morning sun, locked flawlessly into the ancient brick. I stepped up beside the inspector. I didn't argue. I produced the measurable reality. I handed him a digital torque wrench. "Test the primary anchor bolt," I instructed calmly. The inspector attached the wrench to the massive bolt securing the main girder. He pulled. The digital readout flashed green. He checked the depth gauge against the foundation wall. "Zero deflection," the inspector muttered, sounding genuinely surprised. He turned back to the binder, reviewing my stamp and calculations. He looked up at me, a grudging professional respect dawning in his eyes. This isn't just up to code, Mr. Castillo. This structure could withstand a seismic event. The load distribution is flawless. Arthur stepped forward, his face paling. That's impossible. Look at the masonry. The masonry is stabilized by a secondary tension web. The inspector interrupted, closing the binder. He pulled a heavy green sticker from his clipboard and signed his name across it with a permanent marker. The site passes. The structural integrity is fully restored. You are cleared to proceed with cosmetic renovations. He handed the green permit to Caroline. Arthur stared at the piece of paper as if it were a venomous snake. His leverage was gone. The deadline was met. The house belonged to Caroline unequivocally and permanently. This isn't over, Arthur hissed, trying to salvage his dignity. You don't have the capital to finish the interior. Caroline took the permit. She didn't look at her uncle with anger. She looked at him with pity. I don't need the trust's capital, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. She turned to me, then back to the inspector. Mr. Castillo's firm is taking over the entire renovation, and we will be converting the carriage house into a structural training center for local apprentices. The paperwork was filed with the city zoning office an hour ago. She hadn't just saved her house. She had used her legacy to build a foundation for others, creating a space where kids from my side of the harbor could learn the trade without fighting the barriers I had faced. Arthur opened his mouth, found no words, and walked away toward his car. The inspector tipped his hard hat to us and departed. We were alone in the driveway. The morning sun hit the wet leaves of the oaks, making them shine like glass. I looked at Caroline. She was holding the green permit, staring at the historic house that finally truly belonged to her. A training center, I noted quietly. She turned to me. She stepped into my space, slipping her hand into mine. Her fingers were warm, intertwining with mine, a functional, stabilizing connection that made the world stop spinning. You build things that last, Jack, she said, her thumb tracing the rough skin over my knuckles. It's time people stopped judging you for the mud on your boots and started looking at what you can hold up. I squeezed her hand, locking the reality of her into my present. The unworthiness was silenced by the concrete weight of her choice. The real lesson was simpler than pride ever lets you admit. When the pressure hits, character shows up in what a person builds, protects, and refuses to abandon. The clearest green flag was never talk. It was the way Caroline saw the work, the discipline, and the steadiness behind everything Jack put his name on. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.